have been lied
Your
to,
drink, sir.
not by a person,
Thanks,
not by
Sarah.
a book,
Keep the change.
by the
Thank you
game
so much,
itself.
sir.
Poker rewards you for doing the wrong
problem.
things at exactly
Good
the
luck to
right
us.
moment. It punishes you for making correct decisions and then hands you a $100 bill for a terrible bluff that somehow worked. The game teaches you to trust your gut when your gut is the most dangerous instrument in the room. And because of that disconnect, because of that mismatch between action and feedback, most players spend years grinding the same mistakes at higher and higher stakes, never understanding why progress feels like running on a treadmill that occasionally throws you to the floor. I have been playing professionally for 11 years. I have coached over 400 players across 5 continents, and the single thing that separates the players who actually transform from the ones who plateau is not talent. It is not bankroll. It is not even hours at the table. It is the willingness to sit with a lesson that feels like a punch in the chest and refuse to flinch until that lesson becomes part of you. Not memorized. Part of you. That is a completely different thing, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly why. So let me take you through the 10 lessons that actually changed how I think, how I feel under pressure, and how money moves across the table. These are not tips. They are not strategies you have heard repackaged with a new thumbnail. These are the lessons that came with a cost. The ones that arrived through lost sessions, broken reads, and moments where I sat in a parking lot at 2 in the morning and asked myself if I was actually good at this or just lucky. Stick with me because the first one is going to make you uncomfortable. Here is the foundational problem with poker and with learning in general. The human brain is wired to detect patterns. We are pattern recognition machines. That is not a metaphor. That is neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex is constantly building predictive models, testing them against reality, and updating based on feedback. This is how you learn to catch a ball, how you learn to read social cues, how you learn every physical and cognitive skill you have ever acquired. The system is elegant. The system works, except in poker. In poker, the feedback loop is corrupted. You can make the statistically correct call on the river with a 72% equity advantage and lose. You can make an objectively terrible bluff based on a gut feeling and win. And here is where the neuroscience gets genuinely alarming. Your brain does not care about probability. It cares about outcome. Every time you win, dopamine fires. Every time you lose, cortisol spikes. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that manages emotional memory, stamps those experiences with emotional weight and files them for future retrieval. Which means you are not building a model of correct poker. You are building a model of emotionally significant poker. Those are 2 profoundly different databases. A study from the University of Amsterdam tracked poker players across 6 months and found that players with above-average results in the first 2 months were significantly more likely to attribute their success to skill over luck, regardless of whether their decisions were actually correct. The game was already corrupting their calibration. The first hard lesson is this: you cannot trust your emotional memory as a poker teacher. You have to build a second system, an external analytical system that overrides the one your brain keeps trying to write. Most players hate variance. They talk about it like it is an external force, a weather event, something that happens to them. Bad beat stories always have the same structure. I did everything right and variance destroyed me. But variance is not the problem. Variance is just math doing its job. The problem is what you do inside of variance, how your nervous system interprets the chaos, how your decision architecture responds when short-term results stop matching long-term expectations. There is a psychological concept called resulting, coined by professional poker player and decision theorist Annie Duke, and it describes the tendency to evaluate the quality of a decision based on its outcome rather than the process behind it. Resulting is everywhere in poker. You check raise the flop, got called, hit your equity on the turn, and won a massive pot. Your brain files that as a good play. 2 weeks later, you check raise a very different board with very different stack depths and get punished, and now you blame variance. But the original play may have been mediocre. It just got rescued by cards. Resulting destroys your ability to learn because it attaches quality labels to decisions based on data that arrived after the decision was made. The neuroscience behind this is rooted in hindsight bias. Once an outcome is known, your brain literally rewrites the narrative of the decision that preceded it. Brain imaging studies show that retrospective evaluation activates different neural circuits than prospective decision-making, meaning the brain you use to judge your past plays is not the same brain that made them. This is why reviewing your own sessions is so psychologically treacherous. You need frameworks, you need external structure, you need something that separates process from outcome before your brain collapses the two into a story that protects your ego and teaches you nothing. Let me give you a number that should change how you approach every session you play from this point forward. In a study analyzing over 2 million hands of online 6-max no-limit hold'em, players who made bet sizing errors in multi-way pots larger than 20% of the pot lost, on average, 4.3 big blinds per 100 hands more than their baseline leak rate would predict. That is not a leak, that is a structural fracture. And the reason that number is so damaging is that bet sizing errors in multi-way pots are almost never recognized as bet sizing errors. They are attributed to bad texture, bad runouts, bad luck. Stack depths are the grammar of poker. They determine what a bet means, what a check represents, what a raise communicates. A bet of 75% pot with 25 big blinds behind is a completely different sentence than the exact same bet with 100 big blinds behind. Same words, completely different meaning. And most intermediate players are reading sentences without understanding the grammar. They are fluent in surface-level poker, but they are functionally illiterate at the structural level. This is the part of the video where I want to tell you something directly. Everything I am walking you through, the neuroscience, the structural leaks, the psychological traps. These are the exact topics that my team and I spent years breaking down into systems that any player can apply. Not theories, not concepts, executable frameworks. The 10 ebook collection at the link in the pinned comment, $29.89, is the most complete mental and technical library I have built. Stack depth analysis, pre-flop architecture, tilt mechanics, the full system. If you are serious about actually changing how you play, not just understanding it, that is where you go. Link in the pinned comment. Now back to the lessons. Every intermediate player knows that position is important. They know it the way they know vegetables are healthy, in a way that produces almost no behavioral change. Knowing a concept and internalizing a concept are separated by a gulf that most players never cross. So let me give you the neurological mechanism behind why position matters. Because once you understand the mechanism, the behavior follows naturally. When you act first, your prefrontal cortex is working with incomplete information. It has to generate a response without knowing what your opponent will do, which means it is operating in a high uncertainty environment. High uncertainty environments activate the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. Even in a card game, even with no physical danger present, incomplete information triggers a mild but measurable stress response. That stress response narrows your thinking. It prioritizes fast heuristics over deliberate analysis. It makes you more likely to default to simple patterns. Call, fold. The stress of acting first is not metaphorical, it is biochemical. When you act last, the entire dynamic reverses. You have information. Your prefrontal cortex can run a proper analysis because the data set is more complete. Stress levels drop, cognitive flexibility increases, and the quality of your decision-making measurably improves. A study from Carnegie Mellon University found that decision-making accuracy under uncertainty dropped by 17% when participants were required to commit to choices before seeing relevant contextual information, even when they knew more information was available, and even when the time pressure was identical. Position in poker is not just a strategic advantage. It is a neurological resource. Use it like one. The word tilt has become so common in poker culture that it has lost its clinical weight. Players say they went on tilt the way they say they went on tilt at the grocery store because there was a long line. It is used casually, as a description of mild frustration. But true tilt is not an emotion. It is a cognitive architecture failure, and understanding the distinction will change everything about how you manage your mental game. Here is what actually happens during tilt. A significant negative stimulus, a bad beat, a cooler, a perceived injustice, triggers a cortisol spike. Cortisol in short bursts is adaptive. It sharpens focus and prepares the body for action. But sustained or repeated cortisol release begins to impair the prefrontal cortex. specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for working memory, impulse control, and long-range planning. This is not philosophical. This is pharmacological. Your decision-making hardware is physically degraded. The part of your brain that runs your A game requires a neurochemical environment that tilt systematically destroys. What most players do on tilt is try to think their way out of it. They tell themselves to calm down, to focus, to make good decisions, but they are using the impaired instrument to repair itself, which is like trying to fix a broken thermometer by taking its temperature. The intervention has to be external, a defined protocol, a rule set that exists outside the emotional state that your pre-tilt self created for your in-tilt self to follow. This is why elite players talk about session stop rules with such emphasis. They are not talking about bankroll management. They are building an external prefrontal cortex for the moments when the internal one goes offline. Here is a lesson that will make you money before you even sit down at a table. Most players have no coherent narrative about what they are representing. They bet the flop because the texture favored their range. They bet the turn because they still had equity. They bet the river because they panicked. And somewhere in that sequence, they stopped telling a story and started just moving chips. The river is where all the lies get exposed. Villain calling ranges on the river are not random. They are constructed by logical players who have been watching your story unfold across 3 streets. If your river bet does not make sense within the context of the line you took, if the hand you are representing could not have played this way through the flop and turn, then your bet is not a bluff. It is a confession that you have no idea what you are doing. And experienced players hear that confession clearly. The lesson here is not about GTO frequencies or solver outputs, although both matter enormously. The lesson is about narrative coherence. Every hand you play is a story, and like any story, it needs internal consistency. The character you are playing, your range, needs to be capable of playing the hands you are representing through the exact sequence you chose. This requires a level of planning that most players simply do not apply, because planning feels like work, and poker is supposed to be fun and exciting. That attitude, that specific resistance to thinking 2 streets ahead, is responsible for more money leaving bad players' pockets than any other single factor. Plan the story before you start telling it. Here is a conversation I have had approximately 400 times with players at every level. They tell me they have been grinding hard, 4 to 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. They are putting in volume. They are building experience. And then I ask them how many hours per week they spend reviewing their hands. The silence that follows that question is one of the most diagnostic moments in coaching. Deliberate practice, the kind that produces elite performance in any field, requires a feedback loop with 3 components: execution, analysis, and adjustment. You cannot skip analysis and expect the adjustment to happen organically. That is not how skill acquisition works in any domain. A study published in the journal Psychological Science showed that medical students who spent 30 minutes reviewing cases after simulation training outperformed students who spent the same 30 minutes running additional simulations by a margin of 41% on subsequent assessments. More repetitions without structured review produced less learning than fewer repetitions with intentional reflection. In poker, this dynamic is particularly damaging because the emotional intensity of losing sessions makes review psychologically aversive. Your brain does not want to revisit those hands. It wants to suppress them, explain them away, move forward. This is a protection mechanism, and it is actively destroying your development. The players who progress fastest are not the ones playing the most hands. They are the ones who have built a systematic review practice that makes reflection feel like training, not punishment. 1 hour of serious hand review is worth more than 5 hours of passive grinding, and the data on this is not even close. Charter, we have covered 8 lessons across this video. Stack depth as grammar, position as neurological resource, tilt as system failure, narrative coherence on the river, the corrupted feedback loop, variance versus resulting, the review imperative. All of these are lessons that I wish someone had handed me in a structured system when I was building my game instead of letting me discover each one through expensive and painful trial and error across years. But here is the 10th lesson, and it is the most important one on this list. Understanding a concept and installing it into your decision-making are 2 completely separate skills. You can walk away from this video nodding your head at every point, return to your next session, and play exactly the same way you played yesterday. Not because you are lazy, not because you do not care. Because the gap between intellectual understanding and behavioral change requires a bridge, and that bridge is structured repetition with the right frameworks applied at the right moment. Everything I have described in this video, the neuroscience behind each leak, the execution system for each correction, lives in the 10 ebook collection at the link in the pinned comment. It is not a motivational library. It is an installation manual. $29.89 for the complete system that has helped hundreds of players actually change, not just understand. The players watching this video who take that step are the ones I will see on the other side of the table in 3 years, playing a fundamentally different game. The ones who do not will be in a comment section somewhere explaining how they ran bad. The gap closes with action, not with awareness. The link is pinned. The move is yours.